All right, and welcome back to the Bookly podcast. This week's book is The Gulag Archipelago by Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. And before we get started, we have a little bit of business to take care of. First off, this week, I think Adam was supposed to be on the podcast, but he didn't get this book read in time. I'm going to make him be on an episode later here pretty soon. But I'm still looking for more guests to come on the podcast. I do think that it lends itself to a better experience for everyone, not just me, but most importantly, it's why I wanted to start the podcast. I wanted to talk to people about books. And so if you are somebody who listens to the podcast, or if you know of somebody who likes to read or anything like that, please reach out to me. Let me know if you're interested, or if you want me to try to get somebody out on the podcast. Definitely looking for guests. You can go ahead and comment in this video or follow us on Instagram and message us and let me know if you'd like to read a book with us coming up. There's a lot of good books coming up, so go ahead and let me know and we can get something on the books. So that is covering everything with guests. Now, as far as everything else, I think that's all the business to take care of today on the podcast. But if you are listening on YouTube, make sure to comment in this video if you have read this book, what you thought about it, because I'm very interested to know people's thoughts on this book, because personally I found it a bit dense. Like it was a hard book to read and get through, but I think it's an incredibly important book, and there were parts of it that I absolutely loved, and then there were parts of it that I felt like kind of dragged on. So I wanted to know what you also thought about the book, so make sure that you let me know, leave a comment, and then also like this video. Liking videos definitely helps with the algorithm, so if you want to help out the channel at all, go ahead and give this video a like, and then subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so that you don't miss any of our videos coming up. We're starting to release smaller, kind of like mini, I don't want to call them mini episodes, but they're just like small, quick reviews of books, just in about 5 to 8 minutes, my thoughts on a book after reading it. I'm hoping to get a couple more of those done this week. Those seem to be doing really well on YouTube. And so if you're listening on Apple or Spotify, go over to the YouTube channel and check those out. Those are actually doing pretty well. We've got quite a few comments on the last video. Apparently I said something pretty controversial, so people were all up in arms, but go ahead and check out those videos and, start, commenting, liking, helping out the channel. It all helps. So we got actually quite a few subscribers off those videos, so I think I'm going to keep those rolling. And so I'll do one for the Gulag this week, and then I'm going to go back and do a couple older episodes and try to get caught up with some of those mini episodes. And then I think I'm just going to try and do a bunch of random videos too. So if you only listen to the podcast on Apple and Spotify, I'm only going to be including my full-length episodes on the podcast. So if you're somebody who follows along that way, make sure that you also subscribe to us on YouTube, because that's where I'm going to be kind of adding more and more content into there. So if you enjoy, shorter content or different content, I'm going to be creating that on YouTube. And then make sure to follow us on Instagram as well, because that's where we do giveaways every month, where we give away free books. We also try to, collect comments and thoughts and impressions about books. So definitely follow us on Instagram. We're trying to get a little bit more active and engaged on there. So go ahead and check us out. It's the Bookly Podcast basically everywhere. So Instagram at the Bookly Podcast, or at Bookly Podcast. I don't think there's a the. I think it's just at Bookly Podcast. And then YouTube, obviously it's just Bookly Podcast as well. So go ahead and check us out, definitely. And then make sure to like this video and subscribe to the channel. So as always, to get started with these episodes, I want to go ahead and read the description on Goodreads of what this book is, for those of you who don't know what the Gulag Archipelago is, because it's got a kind of a crazy name. And unless you know what that is, you probably have no idea what we read this week. So I'm going to go ahead and read it, and here we go. Drawing on his own incarceration and exile, as well as evidence from more than 200 fellow prisoners in Soviet archives, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn reveals the entire apparatus of Soviet repression, the state within the state that ruled all powerfully. Through truly Shakespearean portraits of its victims, men, women, and children, we encounter secret police operations, labor camps, and prisons, the uprooting or extermination of whole populations, the welcome and awaited Russian soldiers who had been German prisoners of war. Yet we also witness the astounding moral courage and incorruptible who defend the astounding moral courage of the incorruptible whose defenseless endured great brutality and degradation. The Gulag Archipelago from 1918 to 1956 is a grisly indictment of a regime fashioned here in a veritable literal miracle. Has now been updated into with a new introduction that includes the fall of the Soviet Union and Solzhenitsyn's move back to Russia. Whew. That was a mouthful. So, the Gulag Archipelago is a history of the Soviet Union, essentially, especially emphasizing the forced labor camps and the secret police and just the overall kind of terribleness of the Soviet Empire. And then so that's the Gulag Archipelago. So for those of you who have never heard of this book is actually really, really long. So I have here the abridged version of this book, which is only about 500 pages long. And in the actual version of this book, it comes in 3 volumes. Volume 1, Volume 2, Volume 3. Volume 1 is like 700 pages. Volume 2 is like 760 pages. Volume 3 is like 600 pages. So it's an incredibly long and detailed account of all of this. And the abridged version is perfect for somebody like me who could not get through 2,000 pages worth of Russian history at all. So that's actually essentially what this book was made for. So if you're somebody who's like, I don't know if I want to read the abridged version, then, sorry, I lost my train of thought there. But if you're somebody who doesn't want to read the abridged version, then you kind of have to have a little bit more of a background in Russian history. So if you don't know anything about Russian history, or, you're fairly new into it, like I am myself, then the abridged version is going to be perfect for you, because that is essentially why they made the abridged version. They said that they were trying to make a more digestible and more kind of Western friendly version of the book, because the book is very, very detailed and you kind of have to know what's going on in history in order to understand it. So that's why I chose the abridged version. I'm happy that I did. This book was, even in an abridged version, was sometimes difficult to follow, difficult to understand. And there were parts of the book that I was like, okay, I have to go back. I have to remember things. So I felt like there's no way I could have read the entire 3 volumes of this book. I would have been drowning. And that's not to say that I never will. I hope that one day that I will be in a position where I'll know enough about history that I could read all 3 volumes and understand it and appreciate it. But for right now, my mental capacity is basically at the abridged version, which is great, because I'm glad that there's an abridged version of this book because of how important this book is. Now, that's kind of my next thing. I wanted to talk about my overall impressions of this book. And the first thing I want to say is that books like this are incredibly important. Now, I don't think that I can summarize it as well as Alexander can. And so he actually writes a small preface in this book to why they decided to abridge this book. And I want to just go ahead and read word for word what he said, because it very much encapsulates exactly how I feel about this book. And it says, if it were possible for any nation to fathom another people's bitter experience through a book, how much easier its future fate would become, and how many calamities and mistakes could it avoid? But it is very difficult. There is always the fallacious belief it would not be the same here. Here, such things are impossible. Alas, all evil of the 20th century is possible everywhere on earth. Yet, I have not given up hope that human beings and nations may be able, in spite of all, to learn from the experience of other people without having to live through it personally. Therefore, I gratefully accepted Professor Erikson's suggestion to create a 1-volume abridgment of my 3-volume work, The Gulag Archipelago, in order to facilitate its reading for those who do not have much time in this hectic century of ours. I thank Professor Erikson for his generous initiative, as well as his tactfulness and literary taste, and the understanding of Western readers which is displayed during the work on the abridgment. So, again, the reason why I think a book like this is so important is because we have to learn from history. We have to. I think there's some quote out there, I'm sure I'm going to butcher it, but it's, those who do not learn from history are destined to repeat it. And we have to look back on all phases of history, I feel like, especially the ugly ones, and take time to really digest how did we get there? And especially in kind of U.S. history classes, I guess, high school history, middle school, college, I feel like we spend a lot of time going over World War II, the Nazi, rise to power of the Nazi regime. And I'm not saying that we have a very good understanding of it, because I feel like a lot of people still have a very poor understanding of World War II and the Nazi Party. However, I would be willing to bet that there are very few people, very, very few people, if any, in the entire United States who have a better understanding of the Soviet Union and the kind of atrocities that were committed there. That they have a better understanding of that than they do of World War II, the Nazi Party, Germany. It's just not as well documented in the United States. It's not as well taught. There aren't as many, even historical fiction books. Like, I feel like there's a lot of historical fiction books about World War II. There are not nearly as many about Russian history. And so because of that, we're just not as familiar with it. And if we're not familiar with it, then we run the risk of repeating it. And I think I know that sounds crazy, and people are going to be like, there's no way that we'll repeat that kind of stuff. But it's not that crazy, because people still think that communism, we could pull that off. You know what I mean? Like, there are still people, a lot of people, who think that, we can still do communism. And this book is the perfect example of why that's not true and why we just need to learn from history. So that is why I think this book is so important. And I really, really enjoyed this book because of all of the things that I had to learn. Now, as far as from like a fun to read perspective, and we'll go into my actual fun to read and importance ratings later, it's not terribly, terribly fun to read because it is confusing, one, and then two, I didn't love the way that it was all set up. So in The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, which was one of the first books that I did on the podcast, I believe it was like the second or maybe third book that I did on the podcast, I loved that book. It was so good. I will probably read it again. It was incredibly long, but I felt like it was really good. It read almost like a story. And I think the reason that it read like a story was because it was chronological. So The Rise and Fall of the Third Reich starts off with kind of the birth of Hitler. Hitler as kind of a young figure, Hitler's life in the military, Hitler's life post-military, his rise to power, him and the Nazi Party over Germany, and then concludes with Hitler's death and the fall of the Nazi Party. But everything in that book happens chronologically. There's also one central figure in that book, Hitler. So because of that, the Rise and Fall of the Third Reich is very easy to follow, and it makes the story a little bit more digestible, in my opinion. And in moments when I felt lost, I could always fall back on those two things. I could fall back on kind of the central figure, and I could fall back on the sense of time and where I was within the story. The Gulag Archipelago is broken up into sections, and there are like themes within the sections. So let me see if I can find the table of contents here. But it's broken up into parts. So the first part you have is like the prison industry, and it goes over essentially how the arrest process worked, how law worked, who was all involved. And then the second part is part 2 is called perpetual motion, which talks about, basically how people got to the prison camps. The third covers the destructive labor camps. And so this actually talks about the camps themselves. And then the part 4 talks about the soul is labeled the soul and the barbed wire, which talks about kind of, if I remember correctly, let me read through this. It talks about more of like the psychological effects of the camp and the effects of those prison camps outside of just the camps too. So it talks a lot about like the psychological effects that the camps had on members of the Soviet Union as a whole, how it was kind of a deterrence and how people were afraid and all that kind of stuff. And it also talks a lot in that section. It also talks a lot about a lot of the, what are they called? I'm going to get this wrong. I believe I have it in my notes here. I want to make sure that I don't get this word wrong. I don't know here though. Nope. I took it out of my notes because I knew I wasn't going to talk about it, but now I'm talking about it. It talks about like the farmers and the village people that were also kind of driven out during that period. So basically everything bad that happened outside of the labor camps as well. Part 6. That's part 5. Sorry. So part 4, the soul and the barbed wire actually just talks about kind of the corruption and the kind of the people within. Part 5 is Katorga. I can't spell that. Katorga. Katorga. And that is the people outside of the camp. So that's the villages, the civilians that didn't live in the big cities that were essentially wiped out, pushed from their homes, destroyed, and that everything was taken away from them in the name of communism. So again, that's kind of that section of it. And then part 6 is exile, which talks about people that were exiled, because that was another pretty famous sentence. You could either be sentenced to forced labor camps in the gulags, or you could be sentenced to exile. And then the part 7, I believe, is the new part of the story, which is just added here in the abridged version. I don't believe that part is included in the original Gulag Archipelago, but that is the return to Russia. And that is kind of looking back at it all when he returns back to Russia and after Stalin, what all happened, the collapse of the Soviet Union. And so that is the Gulag Archipelago. But all of that to say, it's not chronological time-wise. It bounces all over the place. So it talks about stuff early on in, pre-World War II days, then it jumps back over to current, or not current, but then it jumps into kind of the Gulag and the individuals in the Gulag, and then it'll jump back to, soldiers fighting in World War II, then it'll jump to pre-World War II, kind of post-World War I, and then it'll jump. It's very jumpy all over the place timeline-wise, which was a little bit confusing for me. So I wish that it had been more chronological, because I felt like, especially in Rise and Fall of the Third Reich, it helped me digest the story a little bit better. And then in addition to that, this book does have one central figure, Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. He is kind of the figure. I mean, he's the author of the book, but he also personally was in the Gulag camp. So a lot of the stories and everything that come from this is, one, it's his personal story. It's how he experienced the Gulags, how he experienced exile, how he experienced soldiers and work and all that kind of stuff. But it also branches out into a lot of other characters and other stories and anecdotes. At the very beginning, when I was reading that excerpt, it says, from more than 200 different sources. And so because of that, it is not as central figure focused as the rise and fall of the Third Reich. And again, it makes it a little bit more confusing to follow. So that would be my main criticism of this book. My main criticism of this book is not the content of this book, and it is not it's not the content. It's not that it was boring. It was not that it was not important. It was just, as somebody who knows almost nothing about Russia, Russian history, or any of these historical figures in time, I wish that there had been more emphasis on, on just this is what happened chronologically, and less on kind of all of these anecdotal stories added up together to make a kind of a historical account of what happened in the gulags. So that's my only concern, and I may be the only one, because I did look up a bunch of concerns on Goodreads, as I always do. I go to Goodreads and I look and see what other people said about this book, and the two biggest concerns about this book, or the two biggest reasons why people didn't enjoy the Gulag Archipelago, was one, it was confusing and it was hard to get into, and they couldn't read it, and they felt like it was just overwhelming. And I can sympathize with that one, because honestly, like I said, it's a dense book. I wish it had been more chronological. I wish it had gone over more, maybe more history at the very beginning, so that I could have had a better idea of, major players, characters, the rise of the Communist Party. I don't know. A lot of different things that I feel like I had to try to fill in the gaps myself, and I had to go to YouTube and I had to go to, the internet to try to figure out these gaps when it could have been just included in the book. And I'm going to play devil's advocate here, because maybe it is included in the book and it's just not included in the abridged version. Maybe it is in the kind of the full 3-volume length. I don't know as far as that goes. So maybe it does a much better job, but that would have been my only criticism. And I know that there were other people on Goodreads who kind of felt the same way. The other biggest criticism that is on Goodreads is kind of the very first. So I always filter by 1-star reviews when I go to look at books, because I just am interested to see the people who hated this book. Why did they hate it? And the first bad review for this book was written by somebody who just says, at the very beginning, it says, this is anti-communist propaganda. And then they cite an article from the blog, and I kid you not, that the name of the blog is In Defense of Communism, the Marxist-Leninist blog. I was like, how dumb are you that you really will read a book like this, get through the entire book, and then be like, you know what? That's all just propaganda. None of that happened. I still believe in a Marxist, Leninist, communist future after reading a book like this. That's what really, truly scares me. And like was mentioned in that kind of that foreword that I read, I just want to reread this last 2 sentences here, or the middle 2 sentences of this foreword. There always is this fallacious belief it would not be the same here. Here such things are impossible. Alas, the evil of the 21st or the 20th century is possible everywhere on earth. And I think there are a lot of people like me who just think, who just think we'll never get to a place where citizens are being rounded up in the middle of the night and sent to forced labor camps in, let's just say, Alaska, because that would be the United States version of Siberia. In northern Alaska, we're just shipping people off in the middle of the night to build railroads to nowhere. And for some reason, I just don't think that that's really possible. And then Right when I say that, I read idiots comment on Goodreads citing a blog called In Defense of Communism, the Marxist-Leninist blog. And I'm like, you know what? Maybe we will repeat history. Like, maybe people are just that stupid. Like, maybe there are people on this planet who just look at history and say, nah, that didn't happen. I think we could do it better. Like, it's crazy. And then I was like, well, one idiot on Goodreads does not change my mind. So as always, I go around and I start Googling things, and I go onto Reddit, and I go onto Reddit threads, and I try to figure out what people are thinking. And I ended up, I don't know how, on some Reddit thread discussing this book. And there were so many pro-communist, whatever they're called, not characters, but profiles, users, pro-communist users on Reddit commenting about how this book was full of crap, how Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn didn't know what he was talking about, how he basically lied, how everything in this book was folklore is what they called it, and that it was all just anecdotal evidence, that none of it was actually backed up by history. And then on top of it, they had the audacity to basically say that the United States is no better, and that things are just as bad here, and that it really wasn't that bad in the gulags. And they basically rationalized the entire thing by saying it's just the prison system, and that the only people that were really in the gulags, besides a very, 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 very small minority of people, of falsely accused people, is what they said, very small minority. Most of them were just murderers and rapists, and that's okay. Now, it is pretty historically documented that about 20 million people went through the Gulag system. That would be insane if 20 million murderers and rapists were just going into the Gulag system and that was it. Like, just do a little bit of like logical reasoning and be like, you know what? I don't think every single person that went through the Gulag was a murderer and a rapist. But that is what these people were saying on Reddit. Like, there were, and it was crazy. I mean, it was insane, because I was on Reddit after having just read this book, completely appalled with the way that the Communist Party handled everything. And there are literally people on Reddit with hammer and sickles in their bios and in their usernames, and their, whatever their bio is, like pro-communism, whatever, in their description, their user description. And they're trying to argue that this book is basically just made up propaganda from Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn. And I was kind of mind boggled. Again, I've heard that argument before, and I'm sure everybody's heard that argument from some liberal professor or some liberal, I don't know, kid coming just out of university, because universities are crazy and they promote this idea. Because I heard it even when I was at school, and I went to school in Utah, which is pretty conservative. And I also went to school for economics, which I don't know if you could call that like a liberal degree or not. I don't know. But I definitely heard this while I was there. I mean, one of my mandatory classes to get my degree was it like Marxism studies or some study of Marxism? I don't know. But it was a study on basic like Marxism economic studies, which is crazy that I had to take that. But in my opinion, well, I don't know if it's crazy. I think it's important to understand. But the overall opinion of a lot of these people is that communism just has never been done correctly, and that we should just run it back and try again because we can do it better this time. And that's just such a scary thought, in my opinion. Like, it's so scary that you can read books like this. You can hear, current people who lived through communist Cuba and hear their stories and their experiences and how they are fleeing Cuba to try to come to the United States. And then there are people who have the audacity online to be like, you know what? I think we can do it. I think we can do it better, you guys. I think we can do it better. I just think that that's crazy. And that's what makes this book, again, so important, because it's a story of exactly what happens when you try to implement communism. And I think that it's outlined so well. And it just goes to show, like, what I saw from this book, what I saw when reading this book was you saw a government who wanted, again, to implement communism. And in any government or in any society or even in any group of 10 people, you're always going to have people who are kind of play the contrarian, right? You're always going to have somebody who's like, well, no, or, but how about not? You know, you get 10 people together and you get 10 people to talk about a movie. There's always going to be one person who doesn't agree with the rest of the group. I mean, that's just human nature. We're not meant to all agree on the same thing, and that's okay. It's okay that there are differing opinions. However, communism kind of requires everybody to agree on at least one thing, that you're going to give up all of your possessions and all of your property and all of your labor to be redistributed. I mean, that's the idea of communism, that it's all for the common good, right? And so if there's anybody who doesn't agree with that, what do you do? Like, how do you get a society, an entire country with millions and millions of people to have a 100% buy-in to anything? I'm talking about literally any concept ever. You can't. It's impossible. You can't get 10 people to have a buy. You get 10 of your friends together right now and ask them what restaurant they want to go to. I guarantee you're not going to have 100% consensus on where to eat. Now, how the heck do you think you're going to get a 50 million people society to all buy into this idea that they're going to give up all of their property and all of their labor for the common good? You're not going to. Now, the problem with communism is, what do you do when not everybody agrees? And what happens is you force them to agree through the Gulag system. I mean, that is the story of the Russian communist movement, is that you had people who either criticized or went against or even just didn't go in lockstep with communist values. And they had to stamp that out quickly because it would spread, right? If you have one person who doesn't agree and he talks to 3 of his friends and convinces one of their friends that they don't agree, then it just spreads like wildfire. And because of that, they had to clamp down quick. They had to mandate this kind of all-in ideology with communism. And that is the problem with communism in general. But I mean, there's plenty of problems with communism, but that is the biggest problem that I saw from reading this book. Now, maybe there are other big problems that I'm not hitting on the head, but ultimately that was the problem that was brought to light while reading this book. So for anybody who thinks like, oh, we can do it, we're just going to do it better. What happens when you don't get 100% buy-in? What happens when there are 1% of the United States that doesn't buy in to communism? What happens when there's 0.5% that doesn't buy into communism? 0.5% of 100 million people is still 500,000 individuals. 0.5%. 500,000 individuals. That's bigger than most cities in the United States. And what do you do with those people? How do you build a society like that where you need 100% buy-in? Now, that's one of the great things about kind of the U.S. experiment, is that it didn't require 100% buy-in because we had elected officials and we have an electoral system in which people can voice their opinions, and then based on the voting of the people, the country can move in the direction that the people choose. But if that's not the case, how do you squash that dissent? And how you do it is, I don't know. I honestly don't know. But how Russia did it was they created an entire work camp system through gulags all across Russia, which in its kind of heyday would house, I think they said like 3 million people almost at a time, a little less than 3 million people at a time across hundreds of these forced labor camps. And they would put them to work. And across the history of the gulags, which was, again, from 1918 to 1956, so we're talking less than 40 years, 38 years, there were roughly, I think they said 20 million people imprisoned, and 4 million of them passed away while imprisoned because of the because of the forced labor camps, the terrible conditions. And that's just that we know of. There could be way more because, again, there's a lot of, I don't know, if there was anything that I got from this book is that there's a lot of, one, kind of folklore behind the gulags. Like, I think just with any sort of, I don't want to say camp because that's such a, when I think of camp, I think of like going to summer camp, but the gulag kind of forced camps, if there is any sort of, large group like this, there's going to be rumors and folklore that come about. But in addition to that, there's also going to be a lot of secrecy and a lot of, you don't want to look too bad, so you hide some of the worst things that happen. So there really isn't a whole lot of, there really isn't any way to get some cold hard, numbers as to how many people actually were in the camps, how many people died. I think from both sides of the story, they give different accounts and different numbers, but we do know that it's, more than 10, less than 100 million people that went through these camps and that were affected by the kind of the communist regime. And I think some of that includes the gulags. I think that's the name of them. The gulags, which were the people who were forced out of their home and basically sent into exile, which were, primarily farmers and villagers. So again, that number can be anywhere within there. But all of that to say, we are insane to think that we can do it better this time. And it makes me a little bit sad that people could read this book and still believe that. Like, if that's the case, then like, what is it going to take for somebody to change their mind and say, you know what? I think we got it pretty good here in the United States, And a book like this should make you think that, in my opinion. A book like this should really make you reevaluate how bad we have it in the United States, how oppressed we are as a country, or how oppressed we are as individuals, or how hard our lives are, because we've got it pretty good and we've kind of hit the jackpot as far as time in history and location in the world. Like, you pulled out, you hit the lottery machine and you pulled out, double jackpots here. You are in the greatest time to be alive, which would be, now in history with medicine and technological advances and everything like that. But then you also hit the jackpot in that you live in the United States. And so count your blessings. Or you live in, there's a lot of places in the world that are just as good as the United States. But you live in a free country. Let's just say that you live in a free country with freedom of speech and everything else that comes along with that, if that's where you live. So it's, a book like this should give you a greater appreciation for that. And that's what it did for me. It gave me an appreciation. It gave me an understanding of how bad it can get if we kind of dive headfirst into some of these ideologies. Now, that was one of the themes about this book that I really, really liked, and also kind of one of my experiences of kind of just doing some research about it. Now, the other thing about this book, kind of the other major theme about this book that I really wanted to dive into. Now, there are multiple themes that I'm skipping over. And so if I didn't touch on your favorite part about the book, go ahead and leave me a comment in the section. What was your favorite part about this book? What did you learn from this book? Because there are a lot of stories and there are a lot of, great things and historical pieces from this book that I think that I think are important. However, one thing that I think is most important is obviously the lessons from history that we need to learn, that, we should not be running back communism, and that, freedom and transparency and, that is most important when trying to decide how to govern a people. And then the second thing that I thought was very important that came from this book was kind of this idea of the line between good and evil that runs between every human being. So one of the common themes about Aleksandr, or that throughout this entire book, was Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn doesn't ever condemn anybody as purely good or purely evil throughout the book. In fact, he talks a lot about how at any given time there's evil within everybody, and that you kind of have to navigate that within your own life and understand kind of how to master that evil within you. And I thought that was a very interesting part about this book, especially for somebody who witnessed so much evil and so much hatred and so much terror in their life, to be able to kind of not assign people as completely evil, and also not to just blanket assign people as purely good because of the situation that they're in. I think that that's important and very interesting. So I wanted to read a quote here. Actually, I wanted to read a couple quotes that kind of hit me pretty good about this idea between, good and evil running between every human being. And it's, all right, we're going to start here. If only it were that simple. If only there were evil people somewhere insidiously committing evil deeds, and it were not necessary only to separate them from the rest of us, but to destroy them. But the line dividing good and evil cuts through the heart of every human being. And who is willing to destroy a piece of his own heart? I think that I really liked that quote, because like he said, if there were just good and bad people, then it would be super easy to get rid of evil in this world, right? If it were as clear-cut and dry as this is a bad person and this is a good person, we're going to send all the bad people to an island, and then life is going to be all hunky-dory. Then life would be really, really easy. Unfortunately, we are much more complex than that. And I was listening to a podcast episode between Jordan Peterson and Lex Friedman, and they talked a little bit about this idea of kind of complex characters, and how that this idea of evil and good running between human beings, like living in human beings simultaneously, is evident in literature. And they use literature as an example because they basically say we all can see it in a book pretty easy. If there is a good character and a bad character, and it's just a battle between good and evil, books can be interesting, but ultimately they don't really captivate our minds. They could be fun stories. They could be kind of anecdotal. I mean, we could learn something from them, but ultimately they're not very relatable books. However, they talk about how the best books in history are books with complex characters who are both good and evil, and how we almost sympathize sometimes with villains, and how it makes us a little bit uncomfortable to do that at times. And there were two examples. One example they gave on the podcast, which I thought was on that podcast episode, which I thought was a great example, which was Raskolnikov from Crime and Punishment. One of Lex Friedman and Jordan Peterson's favorite books. So obviously that came up for them, but they talk about how in Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, Raskolnikov is such a a complex character because you at one point are completely disgusted in his ability to commit murder, but at the same point you are also compassionate towards him and you are sympathetic towards him because of the situation that he lives in and the good that he wants to do and kind of his view on, he wants to help other people. He wants to be good. And he's this very complex character that you kind of have a hard time wrapping your mind around, but you also have a hard time figuring out how you feel about him. Like at some points you hate him, at some points you love him. And so they said that more often than not, it's those characters that make us feel in history or in literature. It's those characters that really make us feel something because they're kind of almost uncomfortable because we are that character as well. Like we may not commit murder, but ultimately we are human beings that have both good and evil in us. And so we can sympathize with characters like Raskolnikov. At the same time, we can be disgusted by actions that he does. And that's because we're all, as humans, very complex characters. Another one that kind of came to my mind that's not from a book, but from a movie that also made me feel kind of icky, if I would say that, was The Joker. And Joaquin Phoenix's The Joker that came out a couple of years ago, in that it's also a very complex character that you almost feel bad for and can sympathize with, and at the same time commits these absolutely disgusting acts that you can, again, just makes him a very evil and good character at the same time. Like he wants to be good and wants to do good, but also you can sympathize with that, but you can also see the evil inside of him. And it makes for a very uncomfortable viewing experience. So for anybody who's seen The Joker, it's kind of an icky, almost uncomfortable movie. And I think that that's what made that movie so great, was because of the complexity of that character. And Solzhenitsyn kind of really dives into that theme throughout this book. And he uses a lot of kind of anecdotal characters and stories from, ranging from prison guards to other people that were incarcerated with him, even to himself at one point when he talks about, his experience, because he, as a soldier, fought on the front line against Germany during the German invasion in World War II on the German-Russian line. And he talks about how he, as an individual, witnessed Russians that would rape, pillage, and steal against, Polish people and against other Germans during their war conquest and in their defense of Russia. And then at the same time, he would kind of see those same individuals kind of on the receiving end of that in the gulags. And he was saying how it was eye-opening to see that at any point in a person's life, they could be capable of both evil and good, and how complex we are just as individuals. So I want to read another quote here that kind of dives deeper into that, again, just because I felt like this was a major theme of the book. And again, well, let me read this quote, and then I'll kind of dive into kind of my thoughts on it. But it says, "Gradually it was disclosed to me that the line separating good and evil passes not through states, nor between classes, nor between political parties either, but right through every human heart, as through all human hearts. This line shifts, indeed, inside us. It oscillates within the years, and even within hearts overwhelmed by evil, one small bright head of good is retained. And even in the best of hearts, there remains an uprooted small corner of evil. It is impossible to expel evil from the world in its entirety, but it is possible to constrict it within each person." So, again, this is why it's important that power and authority is decentralized, in my opinion. And I think that was another major theme of this book, which was kind of the unchecked, ungoverned power of the kind of the ruling party allowed for this evil that he was talking about that lives within each one of us, that, is unavoidable to really grow and metastasize into this gulag and this prison system, and it just continues to roll forward when in actuality it's capable within every single one of us. So if we think like, oh, if only the leaders of this communist revolution had been good people, this would have never happened. And again, Solzhenitsyn's argument is that there is no such thing as a purely good person. There are people who are both good and evil and act depending on kind of their disposition at that current time. And so because of that, it again is just another warning that it's not a matter of doing communism right. It's a matter of setting up checks and balances that make it so that evil people can't do evil things. And that really has been accomplished through the system that we're in. We're in a system of checks and balances. And as long as we don't get rid of these checks and balances, as long as we hold people accountable for breaking the checks and balances, that we can mitigate this kind of evil within people, this ability to corrupt people that exists in every single one of us. It's not a matter of, us versus them and their political party. It's not a matter of a good person versus an evil person. It's a matter of creating a system that doesn't allow for evil people to do evil, because evil exists in every person. And I think that was a very interesting argument throughout this whole book. And then one of the last things that he talks about is kind of, that ideology in general is what gives evildoers the steadfastness and determination to do evil. So there's another quote here that I want to read about ideology that kind of, again, piggybacks off this idea that we all have a little bit of evil within us. And it is ideology, that which gives evildoing its long sought justification and gives the evildoer the necessary steadfastness and determination. That is the social theory which helps to make acts seem good instead of bad in his own eyes, so that he won't hear reproaches and curses, but will receive praise and honors. And so in this quote, he kind of talks again about ideologies in general and how people can justify evil acts and do these evil things because evil exists in all of us. But ultimately, he said that it's this constant line of where do you line up on good and evil within you, and people can allow more evil into their lives because they believe in an ideology and they can justify it with this, eventual payoff. And his big example again is communism, because that's the lens through which he views most everything, because that's how he experienced all of this. And he says that there were a lot of guards, a lot of police, a lot of political officials who were able to justify these evil acts and act evil because they believed that utopia was just around the corner, that they were going to use communism to create a utopia. And so they were able to justify evil within their lives. And the only reason why they were able to justify that, again, is because of the ideology to which they subscribed. And so, again, it's just another if we need another example as to why we shouldn't subscribe ourselves or hold ourselves too tightly to any one ideology, but instead we should be open to ideas and to communication and to just knowledge in general. Because if we, tie ourselves to one thing too tightly, then you can end up creating a bigger problem and justifying it because of some eventual payoff that you believe is coming. So again, those were sort of the major themes that I got throughout this book. I thought that it was a very good example of all those things. And also it's a very important reminder of history. So I thought this book was incredibly important. Not only was it incredibly important, but I really want to reread 1984 now. because I feel like it's going to give me a greater appreciation for 1984, because 1984 was written as kind of a political criticism of a totalitarian state, which was described pretty in depth in this book. So I feel like it is going to give me a new insight into that book. So maybe we'll reread that one sometime soon and go through and kind of talk about how things have changed since then. Again, it's one of my favorite books, 1984 is, and I can see why George Orwell was able to pull so much inspiration from the Soviet Union, from the totalitarian kind of regime, the gulags, and everything that came out of that time period from like the early 20th century, because of how terrible it was. I mean, there was so much to pull from it. And it's a little sad that we don't study any of that in US history, because there are, again, as we can see on Goodreads and Reddit, a lot of crazy people who think, let's just give it another try, let's run it back. When in actuality, I think a little bit of historical study could really, help these people understand the pitfalls of that ideology. So, as far as rating this book, on a scale of 0 to 5 for fun and 0 to 5 for importance, we're going to start with importance. It's a resounding 5 out of 5 for importance. This book is very important. I think historical books, especially historical books that cover kind of the atrocities of history, are incredibly important. If we do not study history, you are bound to repeat it. I know that I butchered that saying, but yes, it is important to study history, especially the not so nice parts of history. And then as far as fun to read, I'm going to go ahead and give this a 3. I felt like there were a lot of interesting stories. There were a lot of anecdotes that I really liked. There were a lot of examples, a lot of things that I learned. However, I'm going back to what I said originally at the beginning of this podcast episode. I wish that it was either tied to time, i.e. chronological as far as the way that it was written, or it was tied to one individual throughout the entire book, just to allow me a little bit more, flexibility in my lack of knowledge, I think is the best way to put it. And it is in order for it to be a little bit more forgiving in my just complete ignorance of Russian history, because I felt like there were parts of this book that I was confused in, because I just am not as versed in Russian history as I should be. So that would be my only criticism of it. And that would be what would make it not as fun. So as far as the fun scale goes, I would give it a 3. It was enjoyable to read. I think it was an important story. I think you can learn a lot from it. And overall, I would highly, highly recommend this book. Again, it is, really like a 6 out of 5 on importance. Like, it is as important as it gets. I think books like this should definitely be studied and reread. It is probably a book that I'm going to reread in the future. I could definitely see myself at some point in my life trying to read all 3 volumes of this book. Definitely not quite there yet. I really do think, though, that it is, I really do appreciate that Aleksandr Solzhenitsyn took the opportunity to write an abridged version that was kind of more digestible for kind of a Western audience. And so because he was willing to do that, I think it's something that we should read. Again, I think this is an important book for us to read, and I would highly recommend it, especially if you're a history buff. Go and study some of this stuff. I think a lot of other literature will start to make sense. There's a lot of Russian literature, but there's a lot of other literature that just pulls on Russian history and kind of this idea of totalitarianism that I feel like only attribute to Nazism, but can also be seen throughout history in a bunch of different ways. This year I'm really reading a lot about Russian history. Next year, maybe we'll dive a little bit more into Chinese history, kind of like Maoist China, totalitarian governments, different things like that. Trying to just get a better idea of what that's looked like throughout history, what the results have been, and understanding Again, how to avoid that in the future, I think, is important for us as a country if we would like to survive long term. I think that's important for any country. If you'd like to survive long term, you have to understand kind of the pitfalls of history and what led to it. So thank you for listening to this episode of the podcast, and definitely check this book out if you are interested. And if you could, please leave us a 5-star review if you are listening to the podcast. If you are listening on YouTube, make sure that you like, comment, and subscribe to the podcast, and tell your friends. And then lastly, please reach out if you're interested in being a guest. Would love to have you on, looking for guests. And you can take a look at my list of books on Instagram or on YouTube. If you're on YouTube, the list of books is in the community section of the page, or you can just follow us on Instagram and it's the first post. It's pinned at the very top. And if there are no books on there that you want to read, just reach out to me and we can read a book and do a special episode release. I've read a couple extra books this year so far. I know that we're going to be recording a couple extra episodes here pretty soon. And yeah, so more than happy to read any book that you would like. So definitely reach out and let me know, and we'll see you next time on the podcast. Thanks.